at some of the early 1800s history of Suwannee County, the Spanish period, Second Spanish period, that kind of stuff. So today we're going to be talking about war, Second Seminole War to be specific. This is a map of 1839 showing what's now Suwannee County. At the time we were part of Columbia County. So all that yellow was Columbia County at this point in Florida's history. For those who don't know or have not seen this picture before, Mineral Spring is now called Suwannee Springs. Lancaster is now Lake City. So that kind of gives you an idea of where places are. This spot here is Charles Springs. So this was the major road leading between Pensacola and St. Augustine, with some splitting off various locations. Noonsville down there close to Alachua, that's down in Alachua County. So that kind of gives you an idea of locations here during the Second Seminole War. I have another map from that period, from actually 1835, right when the war was starting, but it's not accurate at all, so I don't put that one on here at all. It would throw you off. But that kind of gives you an idea of what we're going to be talking about and where we're going to be talking about today in our study of Suwannee County's history. So the Second Seminole War. Basically, we talked about it last month, but for those who weren't here, we talked about mainly this part of Florida still being a frontier. The Seminole Indians lived here. There were some scattered Europeans that lived here, or Americans by this point. Folks like Reuben and Rebecca Charles and several others that had moved here in Suwannee County, or what's now Suwannee County, in the 1820s and early 1830s. But by and large, the Seminole Indians still lived in this area. Very much a wilderness area, frontier, so to speak. In 1823, there was a treaty done by the United States government called the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. And what they did was they worked it out with the Seminoles, whereby the Seminoles would actually move down to a reservation in Central Florida. Because at the time, the American government thought nobody would want to move into Central or South Florida, so let's just make the Indians move down there. The Seminoles moved down there. So they were able to work out that treaty, and they were hoping to open up North Florida for more American settlers. So let's get the Indians out and put them down there South Central Florida, where nobody's ever going to want to live. And let's open up North Florida to colonization. So that's what they did, but not all of these Seminoles agreed to it. Not all of them did that. Eventually there was even a new treaty that was signed because they decided, you know what, maybe we want Central Florida after all, so let's try to send them out west, because nobody's going to want to ever live out west. So that was the Treaty of Payne's Landing, which was signed in 1832, and it was ratified by the United States government in 1834. So that treaty said basically these Native Americans that lived in Florida and other places would now move to a reservation in what we call Oklahoma today. Not all of them wanted to do that. There was a lot of tensions. And the Seminoles specifically, there was a big deal about it, because a lot of the chiefs said, hey, we didn't sign that. We don't know anything about that. And others said, well, yeah, we might have signed it, but we were coerced. We were forced to do it. We did not do it on our own free will. So this really is null and void. We're not going to listen to it. So many of the Seminoles refused to leave Florida. Some did, but most of them refused to leave. But meanwhile, we've got settlers moving into Suwannee Valley region, not just Suwannee County, but the surrounding areas as well. More and more settlers. And so we're going to talk about a few of them over the next few minutes, just so you have an idea of who I'm going to be mentioning later on in this presentation, and one or two of them will be in even later presentations. But early Suwannee County citizens. People like George E Mcclellan. That E stands for either Edmund, sometimes I've seen an Edward, but it's George E Mcclellan. Not the same George McClellan you hear about in the Civil War. General McClellan, different George McClellan. But this George McClellan was born in either South Carolina or Georgia in 1808. He had moved here by 1830 in this area, because by then he was actually the clerk of Hamilton County early on. Hamilton County was established before Suwannee County, and he was one of the early clerks of circuit court. So he did that, but he did move into what's now Suwannee County, and he constructed a nice home. He had a 560-acre plantation, but later more than 2,000 acres in size. So he was pretty well off. He got married early on, and he had 10 children eventually by a woman named Sidney Taylor. So he and his wife, and eventually 10 kids, were living here in what's now Suwannee County. His home close to Welborn, which Welborn did not exist at that time, but his home there close to what is now Welborn was kind of like a rest stop, a rest area for the stagecoach or for people that were traveling. They actually became part of what's called the Stagecoach Road, which I live on today even. But that Stagecoach Road between St. Augustine, Jacksonville, that area, over to Tallahassee and beyond. But the folks would stop, they'd rest their horses, change out the horses if need be, and actually sometimes because of Indian attacks or Native American attacks, tended the wounded there at his home. So he established this home and a little community there that he called Little River. So the predecessor to Welborn is called Little River. Same area, same region. Basically had a first post office established there at his home. So he was first postmaster of the Welborn area. Again, called Little River. There's a little river that ran from McClellan Lake into Welborn Lake, or what's now Welborn Lake. But his plantation was his main source of income. And even in 1850, he's listed as having 14 slaves between the ages of 6 and 62 to work on that plantation. Again, 2,000 acres eventually of the plantation. So he was one of those plantation folks. You picture the antebellum plantation owners. Although his home was probably not as nice as you picture it in Gone with the Wind or anything. You can see this picture here, this map shows Little River right over there. So again, the Welborn area. Think of Little River as basically the Welborn area. Some other things that George McClellan did throughout the years. A politician. He was a probate judge from 1841 and 1845. After that, he was a representative to the legislature. Let's see some other things. When our county was established in 1858, he was one of the first county surveyors to go out and survey all the property in this new county. Because he'd been there 30 years. He knew the county, he knew the people, so he was a good person to become a surveyor. His wife passed away in 1860, and he was getting older. I mean, in his 50s, so that was old. Had several young kids still at the house, and so he promptly remarried another woman. Her name was Celestia Holman. They had another child, or they had a child together named Edmonia, which again infers that his middle name was Edmund, to name his daughter Edmonia, but she passed away 9 months later. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, he was commissioned as a captain in the Confederate Army. So he was still serving his neighborhood, his area, even way after the Second Seminole War. So he was a captain in the local Confederate Army. The records also show that we have at the courthouse that, again, he was very prominent, he was wealthy, he was a merchant. He donated goods for those who were in need when the Civil War broke out as it was going on. Out of his eventual 11 children that he had between his 2 wives, 5 of them died before he did. And then he died in 1866, and he's buried in the McElmore Cemetery, which is just south of Welborn, if you know where that is, on 137. If you go north, if you're taking 90, if you go north, you go into Welborn. If you go south, you'll eventually pass the cemetery. So he's there, several of his kids are there, and actually several of the slaves, former slaves, are buried there too. There has been a marker there in times past, and again there is, but somebody keeps destroying it, unfortunately. But there's a monument there to some of his slaves that would have been buried on that property too. So that's George McClellan. I'll talk about him more today and maybe next month. Another early settler of Suwannee County during this period of time in Second Seminole history, Second Seminole War history, was Richard or Dick Tillis and his family. Dick Tillis, or sometimes he's called Tullis. In a lot of the accounts when you read about him, he's spelled as Tullis. But Dick Tillis, he was born in Camden County, Georgia in 1814. By 1833, he was living in that Little River area also, close to George McClellan. In 1833, he married Susanna B. Carver, which, that's a picture of the Carver Cemetery there. But some of these records we're having to try to piece together. And I'll tell you why later on, but the gist of it is we don't have a lot of records from this time period. Whatever county we might have been part of, in this case we were part of Columbia County, we don't have a lot of those records. So sometimes our information is piecemeal. So when you're studying about Dick Tillis, you'll read sometimes that they had 2 kids. He and Susanna had 2 kids, and that would be probably James or Jimmy and Annie Mary. Unfortunately, Susanna died in 1836, so just about 3 years after they got married, so not very long. And she was buried here in the cemetery, which, because of some border changes, is actually about 500 yards into Columbia County. I think at one point it was Suwannee County, but it became part of Columbia County eventually, so it's still there today. Several monuments and markers are there. But Dick, now having been married for only about 3 years, had 2 young kids. He did what a lot of young men did at that time that had kids, and he promptly remarried. In this case, he married one of Susanna's sisters. So this one was named Elizabeth. The Carver family, there were 16 kids in that family. So he had a few to pick from. But he married Elizabeth. They had 2 more kids, supposedly. Again, these records are kind of, depends on who you read as to what they say, but it looks like they had 2 more kids. One of them was named Susanna, which was his first wife / his wife's sister's name. And then Thomas. So he married Susanna died, he married Elizabeth, had a kid with Elizabeth named Susanna. So to honor the memory. I mean, it happens, it's happened before. They were kin a few different ways at that point. Another early settler, and all these folks I'm going to mention later on in this presentation, but I want to kind of give you the heads up of who they were, kind of what they were doing, and where they were from before we get into the war itself. William Clemens and his family, we don't know much about him, but we know by the 1830s he was living also in the Wellburn Little River area. He was married to a woman named Rebecca Whitten, and they had 4 living children, and their names were Clary, John, Susan, and Mary, all born since 1831. Another source says he had 5 kids, so either 4 or 5 kids. He had several young kids by the time the Second Seminole War broke out. It's possible he is this same William Clements mentioned here to establish a ferry on the Suwannee River. It's probably the same person, because we didn't have that many people that lived here. So if you got a William Clemens in one record and a William Clements in the other one, it's probably the same person. So that's a description from the Acts of Florida, where a ferry was established there on the Suwannee River in 1832. So, now that ferry was approved at a place called Harrington's Ferry for 5 years, but what they did after they approved it, they rescinded it. The legislature rescinded it. Don't know why, they just said, never mind, we're not going to do that. There are some records I have seen which indicate that the Clemens and the Carvers were related, and they lived close proximity to one another. And you know the story. People live close by long enough, they marry each other and they get interrelated. So it's probably something similar to this. Just don't know the exact connection there. Another early settler, Arthur Sykes, sometimes spelled S-Y-K-E-S, but usually S-I-K-E-S. He was an early settler. We don't know when he moved here to Florida or to Suwannee County, but we know he was here by 1836 as the Second Seminole War was really breaking out. So he was here. He lived not in Little River area, but close to Suwannee Springs, about 3 miles away, I think. He served in the militia, the local militia that was raised as a result of the Second Seminole War breaking out, and he served under George McClellan, who was the captain of the militia. So he served with this local unit. He was older than these other folks I've been talking about, older than Mr. Clemens and older than Mr. Tillis, because he already had a son-in-law and a grandkid. So he was basically the generation ahead of the other folks I was just talking about, because by 1837 he had at least one grandkid. These folks have moved into what's now Suwannee County. Meanwhile, we've still got those Seminoles that are living in the area. They have not left from those 2 treaties. They decided we're not going to accept those treaties. We're not going to talk about them. We're going to continue to live here anyway. The Seminoles, who have already fought a war is probably the wrong word to use, but it's called a war. The First Seminole War, we talked about last month, was fought in 1818. General Andrew Jackson came in, marched from Apalachicola to the Suwannee River here, destroyed Indian villages that he could find. So that was the First Seminole War. When then he went home, the Seminoles just rebuilt their villages, sometimes in the same place, sometimes they moved, but they pretty much just came back. Really none of them were killed during the war. So this influx of American settlers created another issue, just like the First Seminole War. And this led to what we call the Second Seminole War, which was the second of 3 Seminole Wars. The Third Seminole War was fought in the late 1850s, more of South Florida. 1856 to 1858, I believe. So 3 Seminole Wars that we fought, and they still, not all of them surrendered. So they claim to be, if not the only, one of the only Indian tribes in the United States that never surrendered to the United States, and I guess they're right, not all of them did. Which is why we have the Seminole Reservation in South Florida now. They were eventually allowed to stay there. So these issues keep coming up with settlers being killed, raids being done, and so Florida calls up the militia, the governor calls up the militia, the federal government is contacted to lend the militia guns and send troops down. And a full discussion of that war is outside, it's beyond what I talk about, because it's not all related to Suwannee County. Most of it was not Suwannee County or this area. But I'm going to talk about, for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about several things that occurred either in Suwannee County or affected people in Suwannee County as it relates to the Second Seminole War. So, forts, Army forts. What happened when this war started? The settlers that lived in all these scattered settlements, again, we only had a few dozen families in Suwannee County at this time, but they fled for some of the larger areas, places like Noonensville, even Suwannee Springs, and they would establish forts there. Now, the forts do not look like this in most cases. This one is actually Fort Christmas down in Central Florida, and it's reconstructed to show how a very upgraded fort would look like during the Second Seminole War, but the ones here, they didn't look like this. Pretty much you just have some houses. You might stick a few sharpened poles in front of it, and you call that a fort. But that's pretty much what we had around here. But most of the settlers here in Suwannee County fled for these places. Again, Charles Ferry, Suwannee Springs, even White Springs, Fort White, and Noonensville, which is, again, near modern-day Alachua. So that's where the major centers were located, where the major populations were located. And so these folks would crowd into the fort facilities, whatever they may have been, and stay there for long periods of time. Let's see. One thing about the Second Seminole War was when the United States government came in, the Army, the United States Army, plus the militia units started fighting the Seminoles. It was not combat as they were used to. It was not as you picture Napoleonic era. You stand in a long line, the other guy stand in a long line, you point your guns and you shoot. And who's ever left, you reload and do it again until one side breaks. That was not how the Second Seminole War was fought. It was fought with guerrilla tactics. The Indians would take pot shots behind trees, they would hide out, they would ambush, they would flee, they would give up territory, they would burn their houses to give up territory, to draw the American forces into the swamps. It was a very guerrilla warfare. I mean, it's kind of like Vietnam. Call it a Vietnam in Florida in the 1830s and early 1840s. It was similar to that. Yeah, by 1837, we had soldiers stationed at places like Charles Springs, or Charles Ferry at the time it was called, and several forts in Suwannee County, including ones called Fort Eagle, 16 East Florida, 20 East Florida, and maybe a Fort Jeans. Now, the United States government had a grid system for the forts. Basically, everything east of Suwannee River was something East Florida. So each section was supposed to have anyway, a fort. So it might be called 16 East Florida or 20 East Florida. That was on a grid that the United States government had. If it was west of the Suwannee River, it was so-and-so West Florida. But I'm not going to talk about those. The Suwannee County presentation, So we had several forts in and around Suwannee County. And some of them, though, they were called by alternative names. I mean, instead of calling it, hey, we're at Fort 20 East Florida, maybe it's Suwannee Springs Fort or something like that, or Fort Jeans, named after either the commander of the unit that was there or somebody nearby, just different things that they named them. So 20 East Florida maybe and probably is the same fort as Suwannee Springs. Fort Downing's also mentioned, but it could be one of these other names. We just don't know. And in most cases, we don't even know where they were. Because basically what happened was after the war ended in 1842, whatever was built of a fort, and again, most of them were not like this, especially here, whatever was left or built of the fort was kind of used by the settlers. It's like, hey, we don't need those, we're going to use them to build a house or whatnot. So we don't really know exactly where all these forts were located, other than there's a map that shows some grid locations. So sometimes you can kind of figure out close to where they were. But, you know, it is what it is. You never know. So the war begins. The Florida militia is called up by Governor Robert Call. There's Robert right there. Governor Call, I'm sorry, not Robert, Richard. Richard K. Call. He is the governor of Florida, and by extension, he is the general in charge of the Florida militia, which is the predecessor to the National Guard. So he calls up the militia, and most of the battles were fought south of Suwannee County. Several battles. We've got people like Arthur Sykes, that older man who already had grandkids, to say, you know, I'm not going to fight. I'm going to stay on my property. I'm not going to move to one of these other populated areas where everybody else has moved. Others sent their families, like William Clemens and whatnot. They sent their families to Noonensville and all these fortified positions, and they joined the militia. Most of them, like William Clemens, Richard Tillis, James Smiley, who was Arthur Sykes' son-in-law, they had joined Captain Reed's company of the 1st Regiment, 2nd Brigade. Smiley was the company's first lieutenant. The other guys were privates. Another company was established. I didn't write it down, I should have. But they had several other Suwannee County settlers in, including Andrew and George McClellan, William H. Rousseau, a lot of the Carvers, some Matters, and Richard's brother, Willoughby Tillis. Funny thing with Willoughby Tillis is after they lived here, Willoughby decided to move down to South Florida. And that wasn't good for him, because the Third Seminole War, there was a battle fought actually at his house. I think he lost one of his kids to it, who was a soldier at the time. So he moved from up here to get away from all the fighting, and 15 years later he was in the middle of it again. So they were called up. Most of the time those units were stationed in Noonensville. The fort was called Fort Gilliland, or Gilliland, named after the commanding officer there, who I'll mention a little bit more in a minute. 1836, there were 128 soldiers stationed there. In this Reed's regiment, or Reed's company, which was where our local boys were part of, they fought in the Battle of Wahoo Swamp, which was in present-day Sumter County. It was on November 21st, 1836. Our group distinguished themselves in combat. Now, the funny thing is, even though I guess it was not a clear-cut victory, the American forces attacked the Seminole units and then left because they were out of supplies and whatnot. But the funny thing is, again, Governor Call, as the general in charge of the Florida militia, led the forces in combat. So that was when the governor was leading his troops in battle. You didn't see that a lot, but he did. Very interesting. But ultimately, it was not a successful battle. He was recalled. He was replaced by an Army General, General Jessup, and went from there. Meanwhile, Arthur Sykes is still back home here in Suwannee County, and part of Reed's company was left behind just to protect the area. One of them being Lieutenant Smiley. So he was there. He was stationed close by. Again, they were only about, Sykes' home was about 3 miles away from the fort. So Lieutenant Smiley kind of spent his time between his father-in-law's home and the fort. Well, on January 24th, 1837, Arthur Sykes was with his grandkid. They were shucking corn in the corn crib, when all of a sudden they hear a lot of gunfire close by, actually in the direction where his son-in-law was chopping wood, about 150 yards away or so. And then they hear a war whoop of the Seminole Indians, so they're on the warpath. They're attacking, and so Mr. Sykes, old man Sykes, he's called in some of the documents, but he takes his grandkid, runs to the house. There's gunshots fired at him. They miss him, fortunately, They hit the door frame as he's running into it with his grandkid. Several Indians come out, about 30 Seminoles from different directions, all converging on the Sykes home. Again, about 3 miles from the fort at Suwannee Springs. Now, Arthur Sykes, being a wilderness man, being familiar with the territory, he didn't have just one gun. He had 7 guns that we know of that were loaded. So basically he, with his family and his slaves, would take turns shooting and loading. So to the Seminoles, it appeared that there was a lot more people there. Because as he would fire, somebody would be reloading. And this is a time, an era when guns are not, and I think y'all know this, but I'm going to say it anyway in case you don't. This is not a time of repeater weapons. You got to load it, and it's not a put a bullet in per se. Load it in, you pull the trigger and you go 2 seconds later. It's a whole convoluted process to load 1 round to shoot. So if you're good, you can get off 2 or 3 rounds a minute. That's not too good when you got 30 guys coming after you. But if you're shooting while several people are reloading, you're getting handed the guns. Picture it like Swiss Family Robinson. Y'all remember that movie? Where the dad's shooting and the wife and the women are loading the guns and stuff. It's similar to that. They're shooting, the boys are shooting, the guys are shooting, and the women are loading and handing them the guns. So it appeared like there were a lot of people in that house, which kind of held the Seminoles off. But they just kind of scoped the place out. The Seminoles kept their distance, kept shooting into the house, and then, oh yeah, while we're at it, let's start burning all the surrounding buildings. So they burned the corn crib, things like that. But by that time it's dark, and you got the fire of the corn crib, which gives Mr. Sykes a target. So he's shooting at the Seminoles even more. But eventually he realizes he's going to run out of ammo. He is going to be killed, he and his family. So what he does is he pries up a board in his house, sends one of his black slaves, a woman, he has her stripped naked, and climb under and go on all fours out from the house. His thought being that maybe she'll be mistaken as a hog, which there were a lot of them in the area that he had, that if the Indians see movement, something on all fours, they'll assume it's a hog and let it go. So that apparently worked. She is able to go find help at the fort. They come back, they get rid of the Indians, they flee as soon as soldiers come. Well, as they're scouting the area, they find Lieutenant Smiley, his body, dead about 150 yards away from the house. He was killed in the first shot. So that initial shot and war whoop, it was when they killed Lieutenant Smiley. So we have a massacre happening right there close to Suwannee Springs in 1837. This gentleman here, by the name of Mott, Jacob Rhett Mott, was an army surgeon that served here in Florida during the Second Seminole War. And he basically kept a diary, and when he was done, he wrote a book called Journey into Wilderness, an army surgeon's account of life in camp and field during the Creek and Seminole Wars, 1836 to 1838. So it's an interesting read, published by the University of Florida in 1953. But he talks about this attack, among other things that we're going to talk about today. Yeah, he wrote that on the afternoon of January 25th, 1837, which I think was the next day. Yeah. He and his men were ordered to what is now Suwannee County to pursue a large party of Seminoles that attacked the Sykes home, and he's the one that calls him Old Man Sykes. They arrived on the night of the 26th. They basically had a forced march by foot. Most of the travel was by foot here. On the 26th, they marched 18 miles to the wilderness. Took them a day to get here, and they stayed at the Sykes home, and then they went after the Seminoles. Well, they didn't find them. Seminoles had fled back into the wilderness. So it's very interesting, again, reading his stuff as he came through this area and what he came across. It's very fascinating. I'm going to read them a couple more times today. Well, that's in early 1837. Basically, a couple days later, the 3 or 4 month militia time that they had been in their duty, their service was up 4 months for most of them. So January 27th, again, a day or two after that massacre, their time on the militia is up. Time to go back home. Well, some of them signed back up for another tour of duty. Others went back home. Others went to check on their family and then signed back up. So different things happening. But most of those folks I mentioned basically signed back up. They were in it for the long haul. They want to protect their family. probably having heard about this massacre at the Sykes home, probably instilled them to do that too. This Surgeon Mott that I just mentioned, he continued in patrols, and as a surgeon, he was very helpful with all these diseases that were popping up in Florida, all these tropical diseases. He was very helpful with that. In March of 1837, Surgeon Mott was ordered to meet some new recruits in Noonanville. So they were stationed in Hamilton County and told to go down to Alachua County to meet some new recruits. So he talks about his travels. So they marched across, or went across Livingston's Ferry, which is on the Suwannee River, close to Dowling Park. So they came across there, kept marching south. They reached the home of William Clemens, who I mentioned earlier. That house was abandoned because the family was at Fort Gilliland down in Alachua County. So they came there, and he mentions that they were very thankful to have found that house because Mr. Clemens had a bunch of corn and stuff that he had stashed. So they were able to eat. The horses had forage there, so that they were able to basically replenish themselves after having marched for about 20 miles. Then they went over to Alligator, which is now called Lake City, before they went down to Noonanville. So by the end of the month, they were back at their camp when they heard news about the peace treaty that had been signed on March 6th. So a peace treaty with the Seminoles. By April 10th, the Seminoles were supposed to be leaving Florida to go out west. So that was good. Everybody was happy. Lots of folks had heard about it. Some of those that actually signed it were Chief Micanopy, which that's a picture of him there. Also Jumper, Yahuluchi, and Alatucci. So those are some of the big chiefs that signed this and agreed to leave Florida and go out west. So that was good news for the citizens of the area. Meanwhile, as this is going on, and in the same era, the same year, we've got an election held in the territory to determine if the Floridians want to become a United States state. Not just a territory, but a state. The majority was in favor of all the folks in Florida. Interestingly enough, Columbia County, which included us, was against it. There were more that voted against it than for it. I don't know the reasons why, but they did. Here's some of the numbers I've got. Looks like if you look at the Columbia County site, which again included not just Suwannee, but a few other counties, Suwannee Springs was the most populated area. They had 52 votes, which 31 were in favor, 21 opposed to statehood. The next was Lake City, or Fort Lancaster at the time. There were 31 votes. And some other places like Palmetto, Saps, Carvers, Fort Mills, and Leeds. I don't even know where all these places are, to be honest. But Suwannee Springs apparently had the largest amount of people, probably because the settlers had moved there because of the protection of the fort and the soldiers that were stationed there. But this announcement of the end of hostilities, it traveled like wildfire. People that had been in these forts went back home thinking, hey, everything's great. Let me get back started with my life. But it was not to be so. Unfortunately, most of the Seminoles just said, we're not going. We're not going. Well, some of those that did return home were the Clemens family. William Clemens, that I've already mentioned. He and his wife Rebecca and their 4 or 5 kids settled back home on April 8th. And then William went to Livingston's Ferry, several miles away, to go get some supplies and such. Again, we just read where Mott and the army units had taken the corn and stuff from his house, so he probably needed to replenish his crops and get more food for his family. So he went off. Well, pretty much as soon as he's out of earshot, Seminole Indians attack. Don't know how big of a war party it was, because nobody survived that was around to see it. But the war party attacked the Clemens family, his wife and kids, and just destroyed everything that he had. So he returned home basically the next day. What he was hoping was to set back up shop and continue life as normal, and he found everything destroyed. He found his wife and kids murdered by guns, scalped, and then the hogs were foraging on their remains. So it was very traumatic for him, I'm sure. The details show that they were half eaten by hogs. So terrible, terrible thing to find your family in. That family, the Clemens family, is buried in that Carver Cemetery. So again, probably related, but the Seminoles were not done fighting, even though some were, most of them weren't. So the war continued. This is a map, and as it's described in Mott's book, is the Georgia-Florida frontier. So think of our land here that we live in as the frontier, and that's how it was. This shows several points of interest: Fort Alligator, Charles Ferry, Livingston's Ferry, Sykes Home, Suwannee Mineral Springs, Colonel Bell's house, lots of different places. The natural bridge going down to Newmansville, different things. Hickstown, which is basically Madison today, is on the far left of that map. Well, that Captain Gilliland, his first name is Llewellyn, but a very popular officer with the Alachua Militia. Again, the fort is named after him there in Newmansville. He was found dead in July of 1837 in what's now Suwannee County, close to the Ichetucknee River, Ichetucknee Springs area. So down here. He is found murdered on the road. They charge 2 black slaves of a guy named Mcclellan. Mcclellan was from here, from Suwannee County, lived here, but they charged 2 of his slaves with the murder. And they were arrested in August and executed for it, although it's possible Seminole Indians actually did it. But the judge, as he is handing down their conviction, he says their names were Tom and John. He says it'd be better off if you'd remain with your master, because even if you made it to Seminoles, your lot's going to be worse off. So he said, you should have just stayed a slave. Would be better for you. So they were found guilty and they were executed for his murder. Now Mcclellan, because they were slaves, i.e. they were property, Mcclellan in 1838 was awarded $1,000 from the territorial treasurer, from the state, what we call state today, but at the time it was a territory, gave him $1,000 to reimburse him for that expense or that loss. And that's like $31,000 today. So that was to compensate for the loss of those 2 slaves. It was the last real event here in Suwannee County for a few years. The folks still continue to sign up. They still served in the militia. They were still fighting Seminoles further down south, but there wasn't much else going on in Suwannee County for a little while. More would come. But meanwhile, we've got these other things going on throughout the state. One gentleman is John McElmore. John McElmore was born about 1810 in South Carolina. He received a medical degree in 1830 from the Medical College of South Carolina. And in 1831, he moved to Tallahassee. He opened up a medical office. He stayed there for a couple of years. Then he moved in 1833 to Monticello, established a large plantation. But then in late November of 1835, right before the Seminole War, Second Seminole War starts, he announced that he has purchased Gadsden Springs, which we call Suwannee Springs today, and he's going to be moving here. So he's been in a couple different places, but now it's time for me to move to this new venture over in what's now Suwannee County on the Suwannee River. So he's got a lot of things he thinks he's going to be doing here. Well, then the war starts, like a week later. So he doesn't really get to do much at Suwannee Springs, but he does enlist. On December 4th, 1835, he is a captain in the Florida Militia, and he's stationed at Suwannee Springs. That works out. His home, his new home. So he's stationed there. He drums up a bunch of volunteers, including some of the folks we've talked about and many others. And this unit is quickly pulled together, and a week and a half later, they're in their first battle. So just think of it. I just got appointed. I just drummed up some volunteers. We're off to war right away. No time to really train. No time to learn how to fight as a unit, and it shows. They fight on December 18th, 1835. They fight in the real first battle of the Second Seminole War, which is called the Battle of Black Point or Black Rock. It's near Payne's Prairie, down in Alachua County. It's the first battle. It's a couple weeks before the Dade Massacre, which is in Sumter County. A lot of people think that's the start of the war. It wasn't. Black Point was the first battle. Supposedly, about 80 Seminoles capture some military baggage. There's the baggage trains that's going between Micanopy and some other places. They capture it. Supposedly Osceola was part of that group, but they capture it. They're rummaging through it, and they are attacked by Captain McElmore, and he's got about 30 men with him. Again, these guys are from Suwannee, what's now Suwannee and Columbia counties. They see what's going on. They attack. Well, Captain McElmore orders a charge. Only a third of the guys do it. The others hang back and don't. So the Seminoles are able to fight off the Americans that do charge. They kill 6 of the men and wound several others. And then they flee, and the Americans flee. So it's not a good thing. It's not a good battle for the Americans. But again, they had just gotten together. They had never fought together. They'd never trained together. So they were new to this whole war thing. So even though he lost the battle, quote unquote, he gets promoted. And he is ordered by, let's see some things going on, make sure I get it. Yeah, he stations men at several places alongside the Suwannee River, like Charles Ferry, Fort Dabney on Madison County, Suwannee Old Town. And he's able to stay home for a little while, somehow amidst all this going on, because in 1836, on January 21st, he is authorized to build a bridge across the Suwannee River at Suwannee Springs, which again is his home. So he's authorized to do that, and if he builds it within a certain space of time, he can operate it for 20 years. So he basically got a monopoly in that area, Suwannee Springs. That kind of place. If he's able to do it. But it looks like he never got to do it, because he soon got called up, like a month or two later, he was called up again for service. And in March of 1836, he is ordered by General Winfield Scott, who was in charge of Florida troops, or American troops at this point in Florida. He later served in the Civil War. He was like the first, basically, general in charge of the Union forces as the Civil War began. But at this point, he's still in the prime of his life, and he orders Major McElmore and his men south into what's called the Cove of the Withlacoochee. Now, there are 2 Withlacoochee rivers in Florida. I don't know if you knew that or not. There's the one that hits the Suwannee River just north of us, and then there's the one in Central Florida. Major McElmore and his men are ordered to go to the one in Central Florida and to basically set up a post to hoard supplies, because the Army is going to be coming in a few months to combat Seminole forces in the Cove of the Withlacoochee, which is basically where they've been holed up. It was their main base, so to speak. That's where they were. Major McElmore and about 50 men arrived there in early April. They erect a blockhouse just a few miles from a major Seminole encampment. So basically, we are on the front lines. We are that last post before the American forces can attack the Seminoles. So they hole up there and wait for American forces to arrive. Now, where it's located today, it's actually no longer there. It's under a lake called Lake Rousseau, boundaries of Levy, Marion, and Citrus counties. So it's not a place you can go visit today because of man-made changes to that area. It's a lake, under a lake. So the forces there, the Americans there, called it Camp McElmore, but it's usually in the history books just called the blockhouse, or the blockhouse on the Withlacoochee. Well, what happens is, as that post is under construction, that fort, if you will, is under construction, Major McElmore gets ill. Again, it's Florida, lots of diseases, malaria, all kinds of things happen to folks. And so he takes ill, he realizes he can't do anything there where he is in the midst of enemy territory, so he starts marching back home to Tallahassee. He's going to report what's going on. Hey, our guys arrived, we're building that fort, I'm sick, sorry, but we're ready for y'all to come with the rest of the army. Well, he gets worse as he travels northward. And finally, by the time he gets to Suwannee County and Charles Springs, so he's in his home county now, his home area, but at Charles Springs, he just can't go any further. He's just too sick. And so, as he lies there to the point of death, Rebecca Charles is still there. It's her end now because her husband has been killed. She's there tending to him as best she can. But as he is lying there realizing he's not doing well, he writes basically a letter to the government resigning from the militia because he's ill. Well, he passes away just after that. So he got as far as Charles Springs and dies. He writes that letter residing from the militia, but because of his illness, he kind of neglects to mention that, oh yeah, I left the guys all down in Cove of the Withlacoochee. They're ready for you. And so General Scott thinks that this has been abandoned, that the forces never went down there. So we've got 50 Americans in the midst of enemy territory who nobody else knows is there. Oops. Within a few days of them starting to build the fort and him leaving, the Seminoles attacked for the first time. 50 guys, sometimes there were up to 1,000 Seminoles attacking. They were able to beat them off usually. Now, at one point, the Seminoles do get close enough to burn the roof of the blockhouse and basically burn up all their food. All they've got left now is parched corn. I guess you could say popcorn. I don't know. Burnt corn basically is what they've got left to eat. They've got no relief. Nobody knows they're there. So the Seminoles continue to attack, inflicting casualties, inflicting deaths. The Seminoles, because this blockhouse has survived for so many weeks, they think witchcraft is involved because we haven't captured it yet. Well, eventually they're starving. They're low on food. They're low on ammo. The senior surviving officer, who's not the one that was left in charge because he's dead, he sends 3 guys by boat in the darkness, I think in a leaky canoe, to get out and go find help. Well, eventually in Tallahassee they arrive, and a relief work comes in June. So they got there early April, so May, June, they've basically been 2 months by themselves. And they rescue the survivors, who for the last month at that point have been subsisting on water and burnt corn. But some of them survived, not all, but some of them. But that's called the blockhouse. So when you look up Second Seminole War, just search blockhouse or blockhouse on the Withlacoochee. Meanwhile, life is continuing here in Suwannee County. Ellen Brown and Corinne Aldrich are 2 sisters, high-bred, high-class sisters from New York, who are married to, one of them is married to an Army surgeon who was sent down to Florida, transferred to Florida to serve. Well, Ellen Brown in 1837, she writes about living in what's now Suwannee Springs in Suwannee County, and this is some of the things she writes. She says, quote, "The country folk are made of clay indeed. They are the most squalid and miserable looking creatures in the world." That's nice. 2 years later, her sister, who's the one actually married to the surgeon, Army surgeon, she settles here in Suwannee Springs, and she has similar sentiments. She basically, where she lived, she was renting a room in a store that was also the post office. It was the bar room, and as a center, basically it was the only store in town at Suwannee Springs at the time. So everything happened there. So she talks about it, several quotes here I've got. "My ears are constantly assailed by inquiries for letters, oaths, and curses of disappointment, badly read extracts from the different newspapers, cracker remarks, chicken fights, horse races, betting and bullying, country politics, and horse laughs. I only hope that I may not degenerate." She's not happy about living there. She writes another letter, and basically these 2 ladies and their brother, who lives in France a lot of the time, they correspond back and forth for years. There's actually, I think, a book put together of all their diaries and their letters back and forth. Very interesting. But another one she talks about, she's sad because, quote, "The miserable collection of a few log cabins I have little to recommend it as an abiding place, save the absence of mosquitoes and the virtues of the spring water." Suwannee Springs. Then later on she writes, quote, "I have known so much disappointment that I have ceased to expect good things. God sees fit to punish me, and I try not to murmur, yet I know not what I have done that every wish of my heart should be denied me." She was not happy about living here. Not happy. You don't want to put these things on advertisements to bring people in Suwannee County. But that's how they saw it at the time. But they weren't the only ones. John Purviance, he was from Hamilton County, but he moved to Suwannee County, later became a county commissioner, and I'll talk about him in probably 3 or 4 months a little bit. Interesting story. But he lived in this area. he wrote to his uncle after he had moved to Mineral Springs, said that, quote, the entire region was populated by dishonest and crude folks. Don't stop anyone from coming out but a rogue or drunkard, as there are plenty of them here now. Life, such as it was still going on for some people, despite the war about them. 1838 also sees a constitutional convention. Again, most of the folks anyway in Florida had voted to join the United States as a state, and part of that involves drawing up a constitution. So in 1838, the Constitutional Convention met in what's now Port St. Joe. It's St. Joseph's what it's called then, but Port St. Joe, just west of here a couple hours. And they met together, although they looked at different sites, including Suwannee Springs. Maybe they read what the ladies wrote and said maybe not there. But that was one of the places talked about where they were going to meet. But they ended up meeting Port St. Joe. There were 56 men there. One of them was George McClellan, who I've already mentioned, who, according to some sources delivered the keynote address. I called that museum the Constitutional Convention Museum. A few years ago, they said they didn't have any record of it. But they didn't have a lot of records of that time anyway. So whether he did it or not, we don't know. But he was there, and a proposed state constitution was barely approved in 1839. There were 2,072 in favor, 1,953 opposed. So out of 4,000 votes, there was about 100 votes that separated. Very close. Those elections showed that Suwannee Springs still had the most people, although what's now Lake City had only one less, and a few other places. Most of the Columbia County citizens voted no, again, for a state constitution. And although it passed, it would be another 6 years before we actually became a state in the Union in 1845. So that picture is a picture I think I took, it may be online also, at the convention center over there in Port St. Joe. Just a little area, kind of fun to go look at, and talks about some of the history of the people. Same year as the Constitutional Convention, 1838, the Legislative Council, or Territorial Council, approved a resolution from the United States Congress to set aside property in Alachua and Columbia counties to rebuild the courthouses and jails. So it's obvious that Columbia and Alachua counties' courthouses and jails were destroyed. Probably Seminole related, Seminole attacks. We don't know for sure. There was one guy that wrote that there was a gang of outlaws riding around in Columbia County under John Muriel was his name, and he terrorized the neighborhood and possibly burned the jail and the courthouse down. We don't know for sure. Again, those records are sporadic. And that's why we don't know as much about this area, because the courthouse with all the records and the jail were burnt. I think it was actually burnt 4 times. Columbia County lost their courthouse 4 times. Our records here in Suwannee go back further than they do at this point, knock on wood. By 1840, this is a map of the area. You still see Charles Ferry, Mineral Springs, which is Suwannee Springs. You see it on there. You see Fort McElmore, although it should be probably closer to the river. That's the area. You see several more roads that have been put in use, military roads. By 1840, Suwannee County had 23 families living here. Ooh, a lot of people. So 23 families, not counting the ones that have already been killed by the Indians. The war up north Florida has pretty much gone away. It's focused in Central Florida mainly, down around here, that kind of stuff. You see Gaines Battle, some other stuff down there. That's where a lot of the battles are being fought by this point. But even as the war is drawing to a conclusion, Seminoles are up to no good sometimes. It's been 7 years of warfare. It was America's longest war up until Vietnam by this point. It's drawing to a close. A lot of the Seminoles have accepted the American offer to move out west. Most of them have done so, but not all of them. They withdraw further and further into Central and South Florida, into the swamps. There are still militia units that are scattered, patrolling the areas. Pretty much all those that had fled their homes in 1835, 1836 have gone back home. We haven't had an Indian attack here in a few years. Let's go back home, kind of pick up where we left off. Going on from there, Dick Tillis and his wife and their family returned to Little River, go back home. He is, in 1842, February 24th, he is away from his home, either, depending on who you read, either moving household property or chopping up wood off the property. Well, regardless, that's when Seminoles decided to attack the Tillis household. He's got a son named Jimmy who's able to run off into the woods. He's been shot by an arrow that goes in his back, which goes through him, but he survives and is able to run off into the woods. Several slaves who are building a house nearby get wind of what's going on. They're actually building the house of Amos McGolly. Amos McGolly will become our first clerk of the court. But they are building it on behalf of George McClellan, those kinds of things. They find out what's going on, and they rush back to camp to warn everybody, because they see the Seminoles. And the militia gets called up very quickly. The folks that are there get on horses, start riding around in the various plantations, the various houses to see if everybody's okay. Well, they come across the Tillis household, and they see the house on fire, and nobody to be seen. So they go around, look in the area, and they find basically the Tillis family, most of them dead or dying. It makes national news, basically. The New World, was a weekly journal from New York, wrote about it in March of 1842. And that's right after they talked about another massacre that happened a few miles west of here. So basically, the Seminoles were doing one last hurrah, causing some trouble. But I'm going to read to you what George McClellan wrote, because it's quoted in here. He writes on February 28, 1842, to the governor, who is still called. So, to His Excellency R.K. McCall, Governor of Florida. Sir, it was with feelings of the deepest regret that I am compelled to inform you of one of the most barbarous acts of Indian depredation. On Thursday last at noon, 7 or 8 Indians were discovered in a half or 3/4 of a mile of my house, making towards a neighboring house. I immediately sent a runner to that house to apprise them, and through the neighborhood for the same purpose, but before the news could reach around a Mr. Richard Tully's, or Tillis family, about 2 miles from me, he being absent on business, fell victims to their barbarity in the following distressing manner. The lady, Mrs. T, was shot dead. A young lady who was staying there attempted to run off with Mrs. T's infant, 2 weeks old, but was run after by an Indian, overtaken, knocked down with the limb of a tree, and stabbed under each arm, or nearly so, to the hollow. She is yet alive. A little girl, 8 years old, was shot with an arrow in the back, the barb or spike made of iron, severing off part of the bone and lodging under a rib. She died last night. A little boy, 6 years old, was shot with an arrow in the back near the bone and came out near the navel. He is yet alive. That's Jimmy, the one I just mentioned earlier, that had run off into the woods. The next oldest was killed dead with an arrow, and the next oldest, a boy, was shot through the body and died on Friday night. All the other children were shot and the arrows left in them, except the infant, which was not interrupted. The house was stripped, and the Indians made their escape. I pursued them the next day with 24 men, but did not overtake them until they had crossed the Suwannee. And on the opposite bank they were discovered, but out of gunshot, and no possibility of crossing the river. Thus were we disappointed of revenge. The steamboat that came after the troops at Fort McElmore, as I am told, on its return discovered, or the men on her saw, Indian rafts on this side of the river, and neither destroyed them, pursued the Indians, nor informed us of it. However, Major Raines at Fort White came with a doctor from that fort to see the wounded of Tully's family and promised to do all in his power for us. On receiving information of this murder, he sent for aid to Camp Fanning, and a company of dragoons, which were soldiers on horses, were immediately, or as soon as possible, and returned to Camp F to recross the river and come up after them. But alas, it was too late. They cannot, I fear, overtake them. Yesterday, about 10 in the morning, they made an attack on Mr. Osteen's house, 1.5 miles from the Natural Bridge on the Santa Fe River, killed Mrs. O, and was still firing on the house when the express left for Alligator. The particulars, of this transaction are yet to be learned. I fear the worst. I start off again tomorrow after them. Signs were discovered within a few miles of this 1 day since. Unless we get aid speedily, the country must be abandoned. Not a soldier is on the frontier of the country, except at Fort White, leaving Santa Fe and Suwannee free for them to live on. This is protection. I have stated this much that you may be correctly informed of matters in this vicinity, hoping to hear from you soon. I am, sir, your obedient servant, signed George E. McClellan. So, he was not happy that by and large the military forces had left this area. So that's the last known massacre in Suwannee County in the Second Seminole War. The same year the war draws to a conclusion. I just mentioned it in that book, in that writing, that letter that he wrote, but steamboats first appear on the Suwannee River during this time period. We're going to talk about it a lot more in a few months, but the first steamboats came upon the Suwannee River. The first known one was in 1836, a steamboat called Minerva, and then some of them supposedly helped support some of the garrisons, providing food and stuff during some floods. But by mid-1842, a couple months after that Tillis massacre, the war is winding down. Most of the Seminoles have been pushed into the Everglades or fled out west. The last battle occurred, in the Tallahassee area, or from Chief Tigertail was associated with it. There was a posse. He was a general planner. He led a posse to attack some of those Seminoles who had at last attacked some folks. They spent 3 days searching for them, and they finally surprised those braves in a swamp, killed all 24 of them. The last official shot of the Second Seminole War was fired by a guy, or a kid, by the name of William Wesley Hankins. Some sources say he was 16, but it looks like he was 20 or 21, depending on other sources. He killed the last ones. His son was Sylvanus Masters Hankins Sr., who would live in Live Oak for several years and served in the Civil War from Live Oak. So that's William Wesley Hankins, and Sylvanus is to his right. This is a family photo taken about 1894. So 50 years before that, he had fired the last shot of the Second Seminole War. So in August of 1842, Colonel Worth met with some of the chiefs that were still in Florida, Seminole chiefs that were still in Florida, got them to move, and he declared officially the end of the war on August 14th. So the Second Seminole War ended in 1842 after 7 years. Lots of death, lots of destruction, lots of massacres. Suwannee County got hit. Other counties got hit hard too. So the war ends. And hopefully more people can move into Suwannee County. So next month, we'll look at the late territorial period and early statehood of Florida, Suwannee County.